It is time for another Puscast, this covering the last 2 weeks of April 2015. Do you ever wonder who this is? I never give my name in these podcasts. My name is Mark Crislip. I'm an infectious disease doctor in Portland, Oregon. Been doing this now, I think, since 2006. You can find all the links to my growing multimedia empire, including references for this Puscast, over at edgydoc.com. Otherwise, I got nothing to tell you, except we need to get on to the literature. If you listen to this Puscast regularly, you know that there are a few bees in my bonnet, things I either find interesting or have a particular affinity to. One of those is the hygiene hypothesis, the idea that it's probably good for us to be filthy and exposed to things when we're children. Bacteria, viruses, dirt, vaccines, things that get your immune system up and running. This study looked at the use of bleach in households. And interestingly, in Europe, if you used bleach to clean your house, your kids had higher infection rates, both respiratory infections and influenza, than families that did not use bleach to clean the house. Now, association, not causation. Is it because of the fumes, or is it because they're living in a household that's just too clean? Filth is important. I remember once when my kid was younger, he picked up a rock and there was a slug underneath, and he popped it in his mouth and ate it. And I thought, sure, go ahead. Though I would have preferred a little garlic butter. Anyway, I usually don't talk about pediatric studies, but I do find it interesting that a cleaner household was more associated with infections. Or was it from the fumes of the cleaning agents? We don't know yet, but it's interesting. Another topic I find interesting before we move on to real medicine is the human microbiome. So they found this tribe that lived in a village in the middle of South America, the Yanomami, and they had never had any contact with the West, supposedly. So they went in and they checked their microbiome, and it is markedly different than the microbiome of people in America. It's interesting to wonder how much our diet, our antibiotics, and our cleanliness have changed what should have been our normal microbiome. These hunter-gatherers had more organisms, and their GI tract had more Provotella and less Bacteroides, which is the opposite of what you find in the United States. This is not the first study to show that more, quote, primitive, unquote, people have a different microbiome than people who live in more industrialized societies. Now what will happen, here's where I get psychic, one of the paleo diet people is going to take this study and come up with the paleo microbiome, combine the two, and make a fortune. I should do that, but damn it, I got ethics. You may have heard about the infection that killed somebody in Bourbon County, the bourbon virus. Fortunately not associated with the drink. This turns out to be a thogotovirus, Thogotovirus. And there is a review of the topic in Emerging Infectious Diseases. It presents with fevers and thrombocytopenia and leukopenia. It is part of the Orthomyxoviridae, of which there are 6 viruses, including the Thogoto, assuming I'm pronouncing it correctly. Prior to this, there had been only one other virus in that family in the United States, which was found in a seabird nest off Texas. It is a tick-borne illness and joins the heartland virus as 2 new tick-borne illnesses found in the American Midwest. I should probably record in the theme song to Jaws, but my sound output's not working correctly on the computer. I say this because the CDC has a report on the rapidly expanding range of highly pathogenic avian influenza viruses, the H5N8, which has about a 60% mortality rate. It used to be in Asia, but now it is spreading throughout the world by way of migratory waterfowl. And they found them now not only in Russia, but Europe, Taiwan, Japan, British Columbia, and the western United States, including Oregon. Oh my God. Fortunately, these avian influenza are not very infectious to human beings, you have to have pretty close contacts. But as other studies have shown, it's a quick mutation or reassortment to take an otherwise not very infectious influenza and make it an infectious influenza. I'd like to point out that the 1918-1919 influenza pandemic killed 625,000 Americans in about 6 months. That's the same number of Americans who died of combat wounds in all our wars combined. Flu has awesome killing potential. And whenever I see pathogenic viruses like this wandering, it gives me pause. And although there's debate about whether or not you should stockpile oseltamivir for flu outbreaks, I hope we have a ton of it just in case something like this goes apeshit. Not that you get influenza from apeshit. And when they reach the chicken farm population, which they may very well do, it will cause the deaths of large numbers of chickens. And here's the creepy thing. The vaccine we have currently, it's made in chicken eggs. That virus ain't stupid. Fortunately, though, the epidemic potential of bird flu is extraordinarily low. It currently does not appear to be that infectious, and although huge numbers of humans have been exposed, few have gotten the disease. So it's always worrisome, but probably low potential right now of a pandemic that will kill millions, which is good. But you still get nervous when you look at the history of infectious diseases and how infections have jumped from animals into humans to cause quite a bit of havoc. Things like, measles and Ebola. Those come to mind immediately. So who knows? It is difficult to make predictions, especially about the future. So Ebola is fading. It will come back. One of the questions that often comes up with infectious diseases is how long will the organism remain viable in the environment? In corpses, they can find viable Ebola up to 7 days, although this was a macaque model. But remember that in the recent outbreaks, one of the epicenters started when someone found a dead monkey as they were wandering the forest paths and thought, dinner. Took the monkey home, butchered it for dinner, and that started that little epicenter of Ebola. So if you have a corpse who died of Ebola, I would presume infectivity for at least 7 days. Well, how about the environment? In a study that modeled Ebola and its potential survival in a hospital-like environment, 5 to 7 days on various surfaces is the answer. It depended, of course, on the surface and the environment. But I think it's safe to say that at least a week is how long Ebola could remain viable in the blood in the environment and needs to be taken into consideration for cleaning of surfaces in the hospital and other places. It is remarkable all the diseases I no longer see. I haven't seen a CMV retinitis, a toxoplasmosis this century in an AIDS patient. I also don't see any KS, and this has been confirmed in a recent study in CID that showed that KS incidence is decreased in people who are taking antiretroviral therapy. The other interesting thing about HIV is that patients tend to get cardiovascular disease. This study looked at the amount of myocardial infarction attributable to smoking in AIDS patients. They figured that 1 in 4 MIs in the non-HIV population could be attributable to cigarettes, but 3 out of 4 in HIV individuals could be attributed to cigarettes. Given the ongoing inflammation and increased risk of vascular disease, smoking in the HIV population appears to be like smoking in the diabetic population, synergistic for the development of vascular disease. Probably nothing worse than a smoking HIV-positive diabetic for getting bad vascular disease. I used to not care if my HIV patients smoked because they were all going to be dead in 9 months anyway. It was really depressing back in the day. In this day and age, man, you should be very aggressive on getting them off the evil weed. I don't actually know offhand, I suppose I could look it up, but I'm too lazy, what the current recommendations are for the zoster vaccine. I mean by age. But the age at which it's been shown to be effective is expanding at both ends of the spectrum. It's been shown to be effective down as low as age 50, and now in a study in the New England Journal of Medicine, it is beneficial in those age 70 and above. Unfortunately, part of the success of the zoster vaccine in children may be that since they don't get chicken pox, they don't boost their parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents when they come over and take care of their chicken pox-infested grandchild. So you would think that zoster is going to become an increasing problem in the elderly population who were exposed to prior chicken pox. On the other hand, as the zoster vaccinated children get older and older, they won't have the hibernating zoster that will come back and give them shingles. So we'll probably see a bigger bolus for 20 or 30 years and then less and less shingles as time goes by. At least that's what I think is going to happen. Some of the data to date suggests that that is indeed occurring, although by the first law of medical literature, for every study there's an equal and opposite study. Other epidemiologic studies have not demonstrated that we're seeing zoster at a younger age. So it's a wash at the moment by the literature. Every time you look, there's another tick-borne illness. I talked about the viral tick-borne illnesses at the start of this Puscast. Now there's a new one out of China that is tick-borne. Patients present with fevers, headache, malaise after a tick bite. They had a rash in about half the patients, and they had lymphadenopathy and eschar in about half the patients. Also a little transaminitis. Sounds like a rickettsia, but it's a new anaplasma. It's Anaplasma capra, found in China. And it looks not uncommon. They looked at 466 patients that done got tick bite, and 6% had anaplasma, positive serology. So yet another doxycycline deficiency state that I'm sure will show up on my boards, and I'm sure I'll forget about between now and then. If the boards, however, were true to life, the correct answer would be D. Google it. So this particular study should probably inform your practice. They looked at the outcomes of older women, mean age 79, that is old, who were treated for UTIs. And those who got nitrofurantoin were more likely to have failure regardless of GFR. As you probably know that if your GFR is less than 60, nitrofurantoin should not work. And actually, a lot of people don't know that. I'm amazed at how often I see nitrofurantoin given in people with GFRs of 20 or 30. Might as well give a placebo. But in this study, irrespective of their GFR, they had a higher failure rate. So when you have the elderly females with a UTI, you should probably not be giving them nitrofurantoin. Ciprofloxacin was better in terms of UTI outcomes. And that way we can drive resistance faster. See, it's win-win. Interestingly, there is a seasonality to Clostridium difficile infections, and it would appear that springtime is C. diff time, although winter is when they die. That's a curiosity that I can't quite figure out and wonder if it's all spurious information, just noise in the data. And another study that shows that poo pills are effective in removing C. difficile. They took human stool, and it was purified, concentrated, cryopreserved, and formulated into multi-layer capsules. And it cured the C. diff of those who received it. Not all, of course. There was a 11% failure rate, but poo pills are certainly more tolerable psychologically than dropping an NG and getting liquefied poo from your wife squirted down your throat. I mean, ick. But there is an interesting case report of a patient with C. diff who got stool transplant, or as they like to call it, fecal microbiota transplantation. Sounds better that way, huh? And not only did they get rid of their relapsing C. diff, they got rid of their MRSA and other MDROs. So one way in the future to get rid of MDRO colonization in patients may be to give them poo pills once poo pills become more widespreadly available. Widespreadly available? When they become more widespread and available. I do like to invent my own use of the English language. Well, this is an interesting well, they're all interesting. But my surgical colleagues are sometimes hesitant to put hardware into infection, and I can't say as I blame them. This study looked at the outcomes of vertebral osteomyelitis, comparing those who got a surgical intervention with hardware for stabilization and those who did not. And basically, there was no difference in the two groups. Those who had spinal osteo and needed stabilization did just as well as those who had medical therapy alone in terms of relapse and death. The interesting thing is that the longer they had antibiotics in after they had their stabilization, the better they did. So if you're going to stick hardware in someone who has a spine infection, it looks like your best bet for decreasing your chance of recurrence is to go at least 8 weeks. The 4 to 6 week had a 22% relapse, but if you went 8 weeks or more, you had a 2.6% relapse. So more is better if you decide to put hardware in someone's back. More antibiotics, not more hardware. Unless you're trying to construct a bionic man, then by all means, stick as much hardware in as you possibly can. I've always had this thing against beta-lactamase inhibitor combinations. I've never quite trusted them. I mean, in part, I worry about the stoichectomy. Ooh, I had my stoichio removed. I think the word I'm looking for is stoichiometry. I mean, the beta-lactamase inhibitors in the primary product do not have the same pharmacokinetics necessarily. And you also assume that all the beta-lactamase is going to be removed to render the primary product useful. But, you'd never use a beta-lactamase inhibitor if you had a prosthetic valve endocarditis, so why would you use it anywhere else? I've always considered them to be sort of the archetype half-ass drugs. Does everything okay, but does nothing well. That, of course, is bias. Most patients do fine most of the time, no matter what you give them. But do they? Funny you should ask. The study showed that if you have an ESBL bacteremia and you got pip/tazo, you did worse in terms of survival. A really good and important endpoint. You did better with survival if you got a carbapenem than pip/tazo. Yet another reason not to give pip/tazo. Most patients with sepsis get pip/tazo and vanco. You don't know what's going on. And, of course, that combination may be more nephrotoxic than other combinations. But it will also be inferior if your patient should happen to have an ESBL. I keep looking for a reason to use that class of antibiotics, and I have to admit, I don't ever write for them, probably to my patient's benefit. And as long as we're on the topic of gram-negative rods, there was a mention that if your patient has been on colistin for an Acinetobacter infection, if they get reinfected, they're likely to have colistin resistant. No surprise there. Infectious diseases is nothing if not applied evolution. There is an unfortunate tendency when a patient has been on a course of antibiotics and then gets sick again to put them back on said antibiotics if they had been discontinued. That's always the wrong answer. If someone has been on a course of antibiotics and apparently relapses, put them on a different class of antibiotics. Resistance due to prior exposure can occur up to 6-8 months after receiving an antibiotic. The Borg had it wrong. Resistance is inevitable. English as a second language. You guys have no idea how many times I have to go over some of these just to get the English right. One of these days I'm going to do a podcast with no corrections, and you'll see what a true fumble mouth I really am when I do these things. The only reason I sound so good half the time is editing. And I don't even sound that good with editing because I get tired of doing it. I know. Got an issue? Here's a tissue. One of the nifty results of using the vaccine against pneumococcus in kids, the conjugated vaccine, is that the most common strains are also those most likely to be resistant. And one of the neat things that has happened is that vaccinating children has led to a decrease in the amount of penicillin resistance. By using the vaccine, they have seen resistant pneumococci drop from about 22% in kids, this is cultures from the inner ear, down to 10%, which is pretty damn impressive. This is mostly due to a decrease in serotype 19A, which carried a lot of the resistance. And speaking anecdotally, I don't see resistant strep pneumo in adults anymore, not since about the year 2000 or so. It was a growing problem, and I can't remember, because I'm getting senile, the last resistant strep pneumo I have seen, resistant to penicillin. That, of course, will change. Nature abhors a vacuum, and eventually the current strains of strep pneumo-causing disease will likely get penicillin resistance. But currently, we're having a lull until they can come up with an 82-valent vaccine, which will probably come in a syringe the size of a turkey baster. I live in the industrial West, more specifically the Pacific Northwest, far from malaria, which does not tend to be a disease of great import in my world. Evidently, the old texts suggest that stress brings out malaria. This was a review that looked at whether or not that's true. I was unaware that P. falciparum can cause chronic low-grade parasitemia in patients and then acutely exacerbate. The old literature suggests that various and sundry stressors can make malaria come back, such as fatigue or surgery or other febrile illnesses. They reviewed this topic and suggest that it may be true, although one would wonder how much of this is confirmation bias. But they do point out that, quote, host stress-provoked recrudescence may be part of P. falciparum survival strategy. Very interesting. I don't know if it's true, but it's a curiosity. Now, I was always told that you should never get frozen fish, that it ruins the fish. You should always get your fish fresh. This study blinded sushi eaters in Japan to sushi from fresh fish or sushi from frozen fish, and they could not tell the difference. Now, I'll hasten to add it was mackerel sushi, fresh and frozen, that they tested, as well as squid. These were chosen because they are the more common sushi ingredients that pass on parasites to humans. Why would you care? Well, because if you freeze the fish, you can kill off some of the parasites that cause disease due to sushi eating, such as anisakiasis. So it won't make a difference, at least for the mackerel or the squid, if it's frozen in terms of the taste of the sushi. And perhaps you could freeze the fish and not ruin the sushi. There are certainly some things that are made worse by freezing. Carrots come to mind, but then you don't eat carrot sushi, do you? Personally, I think all food should be deep fried to sterilize it. That's my personal opinion, because my theory is that you die of your subspecialty. So I am unlikely to die of cardiac disease, only likely to die of an infectious disease. I am glad I'm not an obstetrician. And I will finish off with a bunch of random hodgepodge kind of deals. First, there was a resistant gonorrhea in California. It was resistant to azithromycin, and it failed therapy. Remember that when going to Disneyland. The MMWR has a report of bubonic plague in a human that probably got it from their dog. That seems to be a consistent way humans get plague in the United States. Their dog is out killing rodents, then they bring it home to their owner, who then gets plague from them and then sometimes spreads it to other human beings. So not only deep fry your food, but deep fry your pets when they come in from the field. This is a bummer. It was an outbreak of Campylobacter due to undercooked chicken liver pate. Oh man, I love chicken liver pate. Almost as good as foie gras. When I die and go to heaven, I'm going to have nothing but foie gras on my plate. Or when I'm executed, that will be on my last meal. A meta-analysis that then confirmed that irritable bowel syndrome is a common manifestation and sequela of travelers' diarrhea. Group B vaccine did work in protecting kids during outbreaks. We've had AAC and W135 for years. The meningococcal B vaccine is relatively new, only been available since the fall, and it does work. Melioidosis, Burkholderia pseudomallei, has been described in Trinidad and Tobago. And remember, it's also been described in Puerto Rico. So the Caribbean appears to be a place for melioidosis. Cryptococcus gattii is the form of Cryptococcus found predominantly in the Pacific Northwest and the Vancouver Island. It's harder to kill off than the standard Cryptococcus, the neoformans. And this review confirms that, with taking up to 2.9 years for lung cryptococcomas and serum antigens to fall. This would be well within my experience in treating Cryptococcus gattii. It's a slow son of a bitch to get better, and patients need to know that. Histoplasmosis is associated with hemophagocytic syndrome, especially in those who are immunoincompetent, such as HIV disease. I fortunately do not live in histo country, but for those of you who do, keep it in mind. It's especially associated in those who have splenomegaly, elevated ferritin, and cytopenias. Generic pip-tazobactam. Not worth anything, as we talked about earlier, but it is not associated with a false galactomannan assay. It's always on the list of causes of a false galactomannan. The Fungitel is the brand name, is pip-tazo. That would not seem to be the case if you're using the generic crappy antibiotic instead of the brand name crappy antibiotic. And they've noted that atypical mycobacterial infections have gone way up in Louisiana following the hurricanes, and they posit that natural disasters may be a risk factor for getting more atypical mycobacterial infections in your community. And that ends. Woo! Another Puscast. This one is covering the first, no, the last. See, I don't know where I am. Who's the president? What year is it? This covers the last 2 weeks of April 2015. References are available at edgydoc.com, where you will find the links to my growing multimedia empire. Otherwise, it's a sunny day, and I need to clean my grill so I can grill the season's first hamburgers, as well as get my car cleaned out. So I'm going to go outside and play. Talk to you later. Bye.